catching on. Actually, I should say I'm delighted to see such a large participation. So thank you and a warm welcome to all. Today, colleagues from the SICAM, the Sustainable and Clean, the Logistics and Urban Mobility communities, we are here to discuss needs and requirements in the ITS domain on the way towards a common European mobility data space. Valuable insights, we hope, and lots of information will be gathered as an outcome of this workshop. And it will feed, so to speak, our PrepDSpace4Mobility coordination and support action, a preparatory action for the upcoming European mobility data space. More on the scope of this workshop, Lucy Kerstin, the project coordinator, will talk about. But since we have a very rich menu, or to put it in other words, a very dense agenda, why don't you let me briefly walk you through it? So we'll start after concluding this brief introductory section. We'll move on to hear the perspective of the European Commission. Two presentations from DG Connect and DG Move will be delivered. And this will be followed by the perspectives on data sharing of 4 EU-funded projects: FAME, NAPCOR, Phoenix, and Federated. And following that, we'll have a more focused presentation at 11:20 to 11:45, a more focused presentation on PrepDSpace4Mobility and the various building blocks that are required for a future EMDS. After a lunch break, because we're going to need to have a break after all this time, we'll have the breakout sessions, which will take place in 4 separate rooms, each one for each of the communities, i.e. SICAM community, Sustainable and Clean, Logistics and Urban Mobility. Discussions will take place there regarding the data, technical, operational and governance needs for these communities. And when these discussions conclude, we'll gather all together in a plenary where the moderators of the 4 different rooms will present a consolidated report as to what were the findings and results and outcome of the discussions that took place there. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Lucy Kerstin to deliver a short, let's say, presentation on the project scope and the purpose of this workshop. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Also a very warm welcome from our side. So I'm Lucy Kirstein. I work for the National Academy of Science and Engineering in Germany, and we're coordinating this project, but we're quite a lot of partners in this. These first introductory slides, just so that you have an impression about our project and what we're planning to do. My colleagues later on, Sebastian Bretsch from Fraunhofer and Harry Bastiansen from TNO, will take up that and go a bit more into details. So if you have any questions, please keep them for later if they're not related to procedural things. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so one of our goals, and you can already look at that map, that inventory on our website. I'm sure one of my colleagues can put the link in the chat as well. But one of our goals is to have a catalog of mobility and logistics data ecosystems. This current inventory is a preliminary one, which is going to be broadened with further attributes about these data ecosystems that we have at the moment. Yeah, so there is the link. Very good. Thanks, Maxi and Josie. Yeah, so this inventory will actually be beefed up a little bit, and you'll have the possibility to look into these different data ecosystems and get further information. They're currently ordered by different categories and transport modes. So we'll also hear about that later from Sebastian. Next, please. The other, one of our biggest deliverables is the specification of common building blocks for a common European mobility data space, and we do that by trying to work with all of you, and we will certainly need your inputs and expertise to recommend suitable frameworks for secure data exchange across Europe. And we would like to propose these common building blocks in coordination, as I said, with all of you. And this is why we have also these breakout sessions. And I hope that many of you can stay for these breakout sessions, because it's quite important that it's quite a big sector with a lot of different subsectors, of which 4 will be represented at this meeting today.
Repository di tutti i dataset di mobilità esistenti in Europa.
Okay, so we have to. And yeah, the goal is really to ask you targeted questions later on these building blocks and the requirements that the different subsectors would have for that undertaking. Okay, then the next one. Okay, we have plenty of partners. We're 17 in total, quite a lot of mobility-specific partners that you can see on this slide, and on the next slide, a lot of. If you go to the next one, please. Sorry, first, it didn't change on my screen. Okay, and we have a lot of partners that have an expertise on data space architectures, but also legal expertise, and for accompanying us in that and doing the analysis for this project. On the next slide, you can see how we're planning to engage with you. And there's this expert workshop taking place today, but there will also be another one on 30th of May. So please save the date. And if you would like to, we can also send you updates on that one. The best way would be actually to subscribe. Here's the link for subscription, and maybe someone could also post it in the chat. And to stay tuned for this next expert workshop, but also the stakeholder forum on the 27th of June that we have lined up. So next one, please. Okay, so what to expect from today's workshop? I already briefly mentioned it. So next, please. So, okay, very good. So we'll hear from different initiatives. Nikos already went through the agenda and will identify opportunities for collaboration and alignment with these initiatives. But most importantly, in the breakout sessions, we're going to talk about the biggest challenges that the different subsectors have related to data exchange in the community. We'll talk about interoperability standards and protocols that are probably missing or required within, but also, of course, across domains or subdomains. And then we'll talk about together really jointly with you, and we really need your inputs, what your perceived gaps are in terms of trusted and secure data exchange. So what are the core barriers for exchanging that data in a safe and trusted way, and then what your expectations are from this common data space for mobility. So yeah, that's it from my side. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lucy. And now I would like to invite Christophe Almasi, Policy Officer, DG Connect, European Commission, to deliver his intervention on data spaces under the European Strategy for Data. Christophe, good morning, welcome. The floor
Good
is
morning,
yours.
thank you very much. So should I share my slides or you do it?
We'll do it.
Okay, great. So yes, in the meantime, indeed, I work for DG Connect, so the Directorate General of the European Commission for Communications Network, Content and Technology, and I will present how our overall strategy on data spaces under the data strategy. So next slide, please. Whenever we start discussing this topic of the common European mobility data space, it's important to understand that this stems from two key European strategies. On one hand, the data strategy of February 2020, which aims to create a single market for data in order to unlock the potential benefits of data for the economy, for society. And this is what I will focus on. But the mobility data space, the common European mobility data space, is also a result of the sustainable and smart mobility strategy, which is the strategy for the transformation of mobility and transport. And this will be more addressed in the next presentation by my colleague in DG Move, the Mobility and Transport Directorate General. And this is why we're also working on this topic jointly with our two Directorates General. So the common European mobility data space, in brief, aims to facilitate access, pooling and sharing of data from different existing and future transport and mobility data sources. And this will be explained more in details also in the next presentation. But first, in the next slide, I wanted to start by defining a bit more precisely what we mean by data spaces under the data strategy, because it's true sometimes this notion is a bit difficult to understand or understood in different ways. So by data space, we mean a decentralized infrastructure which enables data transactions, data sharing between parties, between participants within a data ecosystem based on a common governance framework. So we're not talking about one database where we put all the data together. A data space allows us to leave data at the source and enable data sharing in a decentralized way, thanks to common standards, common agreements, and a common governance framework. So this addresses both the technical, semantic, but also the legal and contractual aspects, everything that is needed to share and data access in a secure and trusted way, and that's essential. So the data space must allow participants to share data securely, in a transparent and an easy and unified way. A key notion is the notion of data sovereignty. So within a data space, data holders are able to control who accesses their data, for what purpose, and under which conditions. And this means also that data spaces are not only about open data, they're also about voluntary data sharing, so facilitating voluntary data transactions between participants in a data space. And the idea is that will enable more use cases and business cases based on data sharing. And when we talk about common European mobility, not just mobility, but data spaces in general, they of course must comply with applicable EU legislation. And I'll come back to that later. There is some which is cross-sectoral, covering all sectors, and also some sectoral one. And we know this, of course, for mobility and transport. We are deploying at the European level some data spaces in key sectors corresponding to EU priorities. For example, health, manufacturing, agriculture, Green Deal, energy, tourism, and there are many others. But today we will focus on mobility. Next slide, please. So at the European level, at the European Commission, we're supporting the deployment of common European data spaces through a complete set of actions. This is just an overview, and there's might be a lot on this slide, but it gives you a good summary of the different things we're doing, and there's also more information available in the links at the end of this slide set. So firstly, we are supporting the deployment of data spaces by building a clear legislative framework under the data strategy. So firstly, we have the Data Governance Act, which has been adopted, which aims to increase trust in data sharing. And one of the measures it includes is to create the conditions for trust in neutral data intermediaries, which facilitate data sharing between parties. And so those neutral data intermediaries can be essential participants in data spaces. Another measure under the Data Governance Act, which is very important for data spaces, is the creation of a European Data Innovation Board, which is an expert group with representatives of member states, of data protection authorities, and also different types of stakeholders and members, which will issue guidelines to facilitate the development of common European data spaces, and also identify some relevant standards, interoperability requirements. Another piece of legislation, which is still under a negotiation at the European level, is the Data Act, which aims to increase the use of data and better allocate the value created by data in the economy. And one of the measures it includes is to let's say, allow more users and more parties to access data generated from connected devices. So this will shape the way data spaces develop, but also it will further contribute to developing interoperability between data spaces. We are also investing in the deployment of data spaces. And for example, in the action organizing the workshop today, we will detail this more in the next presentation. And so we are mainly through a Digital Europe program, putting some investments in actions supporting those sectoral data spaces. We also have actions supporting the coordination across different data spaces, because cross-sectoral interoperability is essential. For example, if you talk about EV charging, you need both the energy and the mobility data space. So in order to support that, we have what we call the Data Spaces Support Center, which is an action currently running, which coordinates different data space initiatives, identifies the common requirements, common blueprint. It also advises, it will advise the European Data Innovation Board, which I mentioned earlier, and it supports knowledge sharing between those initiatives. Finally, we are procuring through European programs some open source building blocks to facilitate the development of data spaces. This is what we call the open source smart middleware platform, or in short, we call it also SIMPLE. And this is being procured by the Commission. The procurement was open until the end of April, and we expect a minimum viable product at the beginning of 2024. Next slide, please. So yes, this concludes my presentation. This was just an overview, as I said, but you will find more information on those links, and I'm also happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for the great presentation. And it's time now for Dimitrios Gazoflias, Policy Officer, DG Move, European Commission, to deliver his presentation on towards a common European mobility data space. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and for the introduction, and also to Christophe laying indeed the background of how we have reached at this point. You can move on to the next slide already. Regarding the Common European Mobility Data Space, as Christophe mentioned, is an outcome and stated both in the data strategy and the sustainable and smart mobility strategy, in order to facilitate access, pooling and sharing of data from existing and future transport, and mobility, of course. Data sources, we can move already to the next slide. I think that was already covered well by Christoph. Thank you very much. So we have identified 6 objectives that we have already outlined also in the call for evidence that was published back in November and December, end of the previous year. First, we want to identify crucial data and increase their availability to support services that are considered essential across the EU's territory, covering things from sustainability to multimodality. The second one is to help users with specific tools in order to be able to discover these available data sources and also understand aspects of data quality and related access conditions. It doesn't mean that all data will be immediately available or immediately for free, but there might be some access conditions. This is what we want to look at and see how we can facilitate the users into this access, which is also the third objective, and the reuse of data through harmonization, probably of some sharing conditions, and in a fair, transparent, proportionate, and non-discriminatory manner. The fourth one, we want to focus on enabling technical, organizational, and legal interoperability, especially between public and private actors. The fifth one is about optimizing data collection and reduced administrative burden. We want specifically to look into some gaps and overlaps in existing data collection arrangements. And although the mobility data space on its own is not a legislative proposal, still we want to come up with recommendations in the future for respective adjustments in sectoral legislation if needed. The last one is more focused in the other data spaces, as Christoph just mentioned in his presentation, where we would like to look at the aspects of interoperability between the mobility, the Common European Mobility Data Space, and the other data spaces. It's important to mention that the Common European Mobility Data Space, we're not starting from scratch. We really build on and complement European cross-sectoral data legislation, such as the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, and we want to look into and take into account data sharing mechanisms that are proposed not only in these acts, but also in existing transport-related ecosystems and domains. We will see today in today's session, in today's workshop, both initiatives in passenger and freight, and there are, in most of the cases, the data sharing mechanisms that are already quite advanced. So we really want to build on that. We can move to the next slide. Some examples here about use cases that we received the feedback on the call for evidence, where we understood that it would be needed to give some examples. This is just a non-exhaustive list. We aim to outline more in the upcoming communication that will come later this year. The first one, it has to do with increasing the efficiency of the logistics sector at EU level by combining data from different model sources. This could help navigation services to be able to provide more accurate estimated time of arrival, dynamic rerouting, optimizing rest times, and so on. The second one is more relevant with the sustainable urban mobility plans, where local authorities can identify well-targeted measures, and by combining data from different data spaces like the mobility, energy, and tourism, they can monitor the progress towards these objectives. The next one is about UVARs, the urban vehicle access regulations, where some cities are imposing, for example, for environmental reasons. There are also examples of the low emission zones. So the aim here is how all this could be digitized and exchanged between the data service providers and the drivers or the users in general, travelers should be informed whenever they are about to enter a new VAR, for example, through navigation apps, or even get an ad hoc exception if needed for transfer of people with reduced mobility. The next one is about cross-border passenger and freight multimodality through the integration of information like real-time schedules and disruptions. This could be really boosted, and of course, access to tickets in all transport modes. The last one, focus on electromobility at an EU level, how we would enable services to inform users about recharging locations, prices, availability, and overall characteristics. All this data that would be very important to be able to share between the providers and users and EU citizens. We can move to the next slide. We have here outlined the initial vision. I know that it's quite dense, the specific diagram. If we just focus for now on the bottom, we'll see these blue boxes, this non-exhaustive list of EU mobility data domains and initiatives. In today's workshop, we will already see some we will have some presenters on the topics of logistics, for example, that we see on the first boxes. We consider also relevant domains, the national access points and the data that they have to, that the member states need to provide under the ITS directive. There are other domains relevant to rail, for example, and all these, they have already their users, they have already their legislation. So the idea is that the regulations, the idea is to really build on that. And at the same time, we want to discover other initiatives, either national, private, regional, and local. That's also what the PrepDSpace4Mobility helping us with the mapping of these initiatives. And on the right side, you see the other sectoral data spaces. So what we want to propose here is a framework where you see the three components in the center. One is to come up with recommended building blocks when it comes to data interoperability, sovereignty, trust, value, and infrastructure. This already, the PrepDSpace4Mobility will come up with the first recommended building blocks on that. On the second one, we want to create an interlinking layer that will help us interlink these different boxes, the orange ones, the blue, the other sectoral data spaces through metadata exchange and discovery. And the third component that you see here is some recommended standards, of course, using all relevant existing standards and legislation. Here, we also don't need to start from scratch, but focusing on data quality, level of service, and accessibility. All this in order to provide at the users that you see at the top, the data providers, consumers, marketplaces, and service providers the opportunity to link, merge, combine, and discover data from all these different domains. It's important to mention that the data space is not a single database or a piece of hardware infrastructure. We see this as a framework of interlinking and federating all these different transport data ecosystems that are rather heterogeneous and often difficult to discover if you're not an expert in one of those or most of those. We can move to the next slide. The actions that we're currently working on, one is, of course, the preparatory action that is relevant with today's workshop. I will not mention more on that. I think Lucy also covered it very well. And the following presenters will provide some more information. In the middle, you see another deployment action that is currently on evaluation phase. This one will focus on real life, actually, demonstrators of with use cases that will focus on traffic and urban mobility indicators. And on the last column, you see a technical assistance study, followed by deployment action that we would like to focus on the interlinking layer. So from the previous slide that I saw, it's the component number 2 that was really in the heart of EMDS. All this in parallel with the data space support center that Christoph mentioned and the symbol actions. We can move to the next slide. As I mentioned, we're currently working on a communication where we aim to publicly announce the objectives and propose way forward for the creation of EMDS. It will be supported by the call for evidence and workshops like today's workshop. There will be other under PrepDSpace4Mobility. As Lucy mentioned, I really welcome everyone to subscribe to the newsletter. Also on the LinkedIn page, they regularly update the events and the workshops that take place. And I welcome also everyone that has to provide any input of, what are the building blocks that we should look at, relevant initiatives to really provide that to the team. Thank you very much, and back to you, Nico.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for this interesting presentation. We stepped in a bit in the short Q&A part we had. So please, I invite the participants' questions, and also since we spent half of this time interval already, the rest of the questions you can put in the chat if you had any, and if you have any, and the speakers will do their best to answer. So, any questions, please? Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
So
Yes.
I would like to ask the Commission, both DGs actually, to expand a bit on this notion of federated. So you said it's decentralized infrastructure, enabling data sharing and so on, but how are these ecosystems linked, or is it envisioned already, or is something that we are looking into it? Thank you.
I can.
You want to
yes.
start? Jim?
Yes, I can start, and indeed that's I think the key question here, Joanna. Thank you for this. Indeed, that's why we launched these actions, to see exactly how we will implement that, and what will really this mean in practice. Here, currently, we outlined the vision, at least from the DigiMove side, where we outlined the vision that there's no intention to move data, transfer data from existing data sources to one centralized source. That's why we really stress this out, that it should be a federated architecture. And in practice, of course, this is why we have launched all these actions, to see how this could be implemented with which building blocks. And of course, we will rely a lot on the horizontal activities that Christoph mentioned. And Christoph, you can also further elaborate if you want more from Connect side.
Yes, maybe to say that, I mean, this notion of federation is showing that we would like to, what we would like to achieve, the keyword is really interoperability between these different ecosystems, and concretely that can mean semantic interoperability, that can mean aligning on a set of common standards, interfaces, etc. Which can be mutually recognized, and that allows this notion of federation. And we can also imagine some central components, for example, this interlinking layer Dimitrios was talking about, which help to discover data across different sources. But indeed, this is all still under development, and this is precisely one of the roles of this action. And also, the goal is not to all of a sudden impose a set of very specific requirements on all existing ecosystems, but more developing a common recommended framework to drive this progressive convergence.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Joanna, Christoph, and Dimitris. And if we do not have any other question from the audience, we may proceed in the next part of
Wait,
our agenda.
Nico, we have a question.
Do we?
From
Okay.
Georgios Karagiannis.
George,
muted.
good morning.
You're muted,
Please.
George.
Yeah, I'm George Karagiannis. So thanks very much for the for the nice presentations and interesting presentations. Just coming back on the previous question. So federation is, I assume that you refer to federation between the in the mobility data space, but as well between different data spaces. In this case, what do you think that there will be several differences in the interoperability, support that needs to be done from the point of standardization? Do you think that there will be, some standards that will be used for both types? I mean, federation within and mobility data space, or and between the data spaces, so mobility, green, things like that. So I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Maybe I can start on this. So, I mean, we expect that a large part of those, let's say, common requirements, standards, will be applicable across sectors. And that's why also we have these important cross-sectoral actions like the Data Spaces Support Center and Simple. And we have one of the tasks of the preparatory actions focusing on the sectoral data spaces, like for example the mobility one, is to try to identify are there some areas, certain types of let's say requirements, for example, I don't know, interfaces that are more specific to a sector, or can we really rely on the cross-sectoral framework? But this is still under analysis, and actually, again, insights on this would be very valuable. But we would like to, through coordination between different initiatives, really promote cross-sectoral interoperability.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can just add to that, indeed, as Christoph mentioned before, we will probably not have only one solution or one standard that will fit all, right? You see already on the slide that I had with all the initiatives, how broad the areas are, how different and diverse the ecosystems are. So indeed, we will have to look into most of this on case by case, actually. In some cases, I think they might not even be, let's say, the intermediary will not even be EMDS. We may have just peer-to-peer exchange. This is also something that we will look into. So that's why there is. I don't think there will be only one solution fits all, but there will be a lot of work needed to be done here.
Okay, thank you, George.
Thank you. Good.
Christoph and Dimitris, and now it's high time to proceed to our next time slot, 4 different perspectives on data sharing in Europe, and we'll listen to presentations from 4 different projects, starting from FAME project. The presentation will be delivered by Dr. Stefan Drecher, Senior Manager, Innovation and Deployment, Vertical. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikos. Can you all hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Nikos, and thanks to the PrepDSpace4Mobility Consortium for giving me this opportunity to share a bit our challenges that we have in CCAM. So my name is Stefan Dreher. I'm Senior Manager for CCAM at Vertical ITS Europe, and I'm coordinating the European-funded FAME project, but I'm also a member of the executive group of the CCAM partnership, where I'm leading the cluster on coordination. And my presentation today, I think, would actually be done with these both roles in mind. So I will a bit extend the scope. So I want to cover not only the perspective of the FAME project, but also the general needs and the concerns from several of the other CCAM clusters that we have, as we have been discussing these data sharing issues in the CCAM partnership. So if we start with my next slide. Thank you. So before I speak about the general challenges we have for data sharing in CCAM, let me just provide you a quick background information about the CCAM partnership. So the CCAM partnership, which was launched in 2021, defines, as you might know, the strategic research and innovation agenda for CCAM, and as well the associated Horizon Europe calls with the European Commission. So the work of the partnership is structured according to 7 clusters, which are represented by these concentric circles on the right. I've highlighted here the clusters that are dealing in particular with data sharing related topics. So on top on red, we have the coordination cluster. And then in orange, we have the other more technology-related and infrastructure-related clusters, like the cluster 3 on validation, cluster 4 on the integration of the vehicle into the infrastructure, and then the cluster 5, which is about key enabling technology, which means cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And then I have related these different clusters here to some points, which just to explain a bit what we have been discussing in the CCAM partnership and the related actions. So regarding cluster 7, so cluster 7 is looking into coordination between different research and innovation and demonstration activities in Europe. And therefore, it's looking at indeed optimizing the reuse of data, optimizing the sharing of best practices across the different projects and initiatives. And one of the important challenges we have there is that there is a lack of sharing of test data. This can be due to several reasons. Generally, when projects end, there is no funding left to maintain the databases. Or there is a lack of proper metadata description. It's not used there. It's not necessarily using a harmonized format, or it can be as well GDPR reasons preventing the reuse of the data afterwards. So the challenge here is that significant resources are generally spent in a project. It can be up to 80%, for example, to collect the data, but not much is left actually to analyze it afterwards. So if the projects could reuse the data that it has been already collected, it could definitely benefit all. Then for the other clusters, a main challenge is that these clusters require a lot of non-competitive data in addition to what they are collecting. So this is very needed for safety validation, but as well monitoring of the use of automated driving systems and functions. A lot of data is required for training of artificial intelligence and sensors as well. And finally, to create the digital twins, we also need to have access to many different data sources. And what we see now is in the current context of the policy developments, so the EU data strategy, mobility data space, and as well the sectoral developments like the update of the ITS directive, we still see a gap between actually the needs for mobility data specifically and the CCAM data needs. There are different purposes for this data. There are different granularities, different harmonization needs. So if we go to my next slide. So that's now a bit more related to cluster 7, and the activities there on coordination. So in order to address the first point I mentioned, so the lack of sharing of test data, we have already started building since actually 2016, with a series of projects, a test data sharing framework. So this test data sharing framework is available on the knowledge base. I've included the address below online that has been built by the Arcade project. And the test data framework actually is meant to support projects and organizations by giving hands-on recommendations in different topics that are important to enable the sharing and reuse of data. So the framework has been focusing on field operational tests, but it has been adapted to automated driving in particular during the previous project Carte and Arcade. And there are 7 topics, as you can see on the box on the left. So 5 of them are administrative topics. So it contains information about agreements and contracts, training, application procedures, support and research services, and as well financial models. And then the 2 topics at the bottom are more practical and data-centric. So there's a data and metadata description that outlines a model actually for the different aspects of describing the data. And then there's also a section on what we need to consider in terms of data protection. So in the next slide, so the Arcade project ended last year, and the follow-up project FAME started in July 2022. And there we have decided to go a step beyond, because there's still as you see here, the list of challenges that we still have. There are still important inefficiencies regarding the test data sharing. And therefore, one of the objectives is to build a CCAM test data space, at least a demonstrator, in order to enable the trusted data sharing between different types of stakeholders within the CCAM community. And this data space will be part of what we call a European framework for CCAM testing that is meant to facilitate all the CCAM testing initiatives in Europe. On the next slide, so what does it mean in practice? As what you can see on the top here on this picture is what we have currently. We have in the knowledge base a collection of methodologies to support the execution of testing, and as well to see and to help aligning research and innovation in Europe. And the idea is now to develop what is at the bottom, so to develop this European framework for testing on public growth. And as you can see, the test data sharing framework is only one of these components. I highlighted it in red here, but it has, of course, a link with other components we are developing, in particular regarding, for example, the taxonomy. So what we will do is we will continue collecting best practices on data sharing, data formats, labeling, access, processing, and transfer. And then we will specify a common open and accessible test data exchange platform. This will then also include developing an annotation model, which can be linked to this taxonomy I mentioned. And then the idea is to implement a proof of concept based on an existing platform to demonstrate the technical and administrative aspects of CCAM test data sharing. On the next slide, so in order to do that, we need the cooperation of the different projects in the CCAM area. And so that's in FAME, we have a role of as well enabling consultation between projects. And we have reached out to the many different projects that started now as part of the CCAM partnership, together with the support of the CCAM partnership, to involve them in the this test data sharing space developments. And nearly all of them have agreed to actually share their data. So it will be at different levels. We have projects with large-scale demonstrations that will share the test data. We have also projects with vehicle technologies that will share actually information about how this technology are used and monitored. We have as well projects on physical and digital infrastructure that will also share this information for the digital twin. Validation projects, obviously, I think I said this is a very important point as well, to create the scenario databases in the future. Key enabling technologies, so these are all the projects dealing with artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and finally, even societal aspects. So we really expect that there will be a contribution and that from these different projects on their needs as well, and that they will be able to share their data so that we have a really efficient demonstrator. So then to the next slide, that's my last slide. And just to highlight a bit what are the next steps and what are the needs now regarding CCAM. And this is meant as an introduction actually to our discussions in the breakout session this afternoon on CCAM. So I have presented the path that we are taking now with FAME to build this test data space, which is specifically focused on facilitating exchange of test data. So we will end up with a CCAM data space, a demonstrator. But in parallel, there are other initiatives in CCAM. So for example, I have mentioned here the Sunrise project, which is developing currently a CCAM safety assurance framework. And there is the objective to, in the follow-up actions as well, to then create a European-wide database of scenarios. And that could be also very helpful to monitor as well the progress of the ADS regulations and monitoring how these systems are being used. So we really see now that there will be many different data spaces developed within CCAM. They all have different purposes, as I mentioned, different granularities, different needs. And the question for us is now, how does this fit and how can this be all linked with the mobility data space? So that's it for my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan, for this interesting presentation. I invite now Frank Dams, Senior Manager, Innovation and Deployment Ertico, to deliver his presentation on NAPCore. Frank?
Yeah, I'm here. Let's see if the camera also works. Yeah, okay. Hey.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, well, welcome to all. Let me share. You have already the presentation. Yeah, this presentation contains a lot of slides, but I'm going quickly through it given the time.
Yeah, request before you start, Frank, a request to you and all speakers to stick to the timing. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Frank Daams. I'm Senior Manager at Ertico, and in this context, I'm also the coordinator of the TNITS Ertico Innovation Platform. And that's exactly what this presentation is about. It's about the introduction to TNITS and NAPCore as an information input to this interesting workshop. So next slide. So I'm not going to talk about the EU data strategy. That's already been done, I guess. I'm not going to talk about Ertico because you all know it. I will address TNITS because probably this is new to you and maybe you have heard about it. And I will explain how it fits to the EU mobility data space, which was explained before, and also the important project of NAPCore, where we are partnering, where TNITS is really an interesting element in it. Next slide. We can skip the next slide. Next slide. Next slide. TNITS itself. So TNITS stands for Transport Network ITS, Intelligent Transport Systems, or whatever the I means. Well, in essence, it's we have a duality in this addressing. So on one hand, it's an EU, and I would call it de facto standard for data sharing for digital map attributes, addressing the static data part of the real-time traffic and real-time traffic information systems in the Delegate Regulation 2020-670, which has been issued. It's also a standard in the CEN. It's not really a standard yet. It's the Technical Committee Work 278 Workgroup 7 that deals with it. And interesting to know that 14 member states today have implemented TNITS, thanks to the CEF project TNITS Go that was finished, let's say, 1 year ago. On the other hand, it's also a multi-stakeholder association as innovation platform under the Ertico umbrella, so to maintain, deploy, and develop the standard itself. And that's where I'm the coordinator of. Next slide. So the vision is, it's really a map-related effort, data sharing from the authority, the road authority, the member state road authority, or any other road authority, can be public and private, towards the service provider that brings maps as a base layer for navigation systems, for instance, in your car or in your phone or whatever. So the vision is, of course, to bring fresher and trusted map data to intelligent transport services, and we facilitate and foster the exchange of it. So the word trust has been set here, and it's really the key element in this data provisioning, because, well, yeah, many sources of data for maps are there, but the difference between TNITS related data and other data is that it comes from the authority. So that's the basis for trust. In itself, it's maybe not the key driver or the key basis for trust. It has also a lot of technical aspects, and it's exactly our aim to strengthen that technical element, to really have a trusted data exchange so that the user knows that this is regulatory data coming from the authority. Next slide. Yeah, I don't have to explain the reason why maps are very important. It's HALT, and it enables a lot of applications. In the first instance, safety and ISA, for instance, where the digital map can really play an important role. This slide is coming from here, and I give it as a background information. Next slide. So this is what it's about. So TNITS within the EU mobility data space. This drawing explains exactly what we are currently developing, and also which is in place in many countries already in a certain instance for it. We are talking about, let's say, the map-related data, which we call base layer data, because it's the basis for every service that you can find. So TNITS is the, let's say, the exchange platform where map updates are transferred to the service provider, and the service provider makes sure that it is going to be in a, let's say, consumer-oriented application. So on one hand, we are talking about reliability, fresh and trusted data. We also worked on a feedback loop, which is an interesting topic in the data space. How can we improve the data quality by, let's say, checking if it's according to standard, or even if it's according to reality. So the digital twin should match the physical reality. You also see DATEX. This is related to the dynamic data in the RTTI delegate regulation, where we have a very close cooperation. And I give you a preview of the Congress that TNITS and DATEX is having an important merging and fusion action right now to strengthen each other's standards and to strengthen the application for that. And then you have, of course, also the multimodal data and metadata, which also plays an important role in supporting, let's say, the quality and the trust of data. And this is a topic that is being worked out in the National Access Point Coordination Project, NAPCOR. So the idea is that all these data feeds, which are authoritative and trusted, should come via the national access points, which are mandatory to be implemented in every state. Thanks. Next slide. Yeah, so there are many reasons to apply it. I'm going to skip this slide as well. Next slide. The roadmap that you have, it's completely driven by automation. It's also driven by safety and the goals of the European Union in the data space. Next slide. Yeah, this is an implementation in Flanders. Next slide. Too many slides here. It also can be automated. So now coming to the NAPCOR project. So it's really an important supporting project. It's a CEF program, support action. It's about a federation of national access points where there is a single URL, unique location, where you find a website to go to the authentic data sources. So it's mainly authoritative, trusted data, but also data from private instances. And the objective is to set up long-term governance structure of this project via the NAPCOR project for the harmonize the national access points, design and develop common tools, which are very important, and plan and coordinate data collection initiatives, which not the collection itself, but how it should be and what type of data can be allowed, what are the compliance rules for that, what are the quality levels, etc., etc. So it's really the harmonizing the assessment of compliance. That's one of the important work groups as well. Next. Yeah, the goal of the action is, of course, to empower the national access points as the backbone of the ITS digital infrastructure and facilitate the national and EU-wide operation coordination and harmonization and implementation of these European specifications where DATEX and TNITS belong to. Next. Yeah, the objective is, of course, to become a leading player in the data-driven society. We, of course, supporting the creation of a single market of data, all in line with whatever we have heard before in this interesting workshop. And limit the impact of transport sector on the environment. That's also, of course, a goal. Next slide. So this gives you a little bit of the background of this project, the NAPCOR project. It's really the first project that gathers all the member states and even the associated states, so like Norway, UK, Switzerland. So it's one of these mega projects where it is bringing together all the authorities together, where the national access points are then, let's say, harmonized. It started 1st of April, but honestly speaking, we are now halfway because it is, of course, like a diesel engine to bring all these countries together and all these authorities together. But now we make really a lot of progress. So the completion date is for the 31st of December of 2024, with quite a grant and a support from the Commission to support, let's say, this important action. Next. And this is my last slide. This is my last slide, Nico. So thanks. I'm focusing on what we do as TNITS in this sub-working group 2 in NAPCOR, because it's all related exactly to enhance this data chain. We, of course, we align with the other data formats like DATEX and the multimodal and the metadata to really make sure that there's no confusion in the market what kind of data you should use for the mobility data space, and that it is a clear definition. There's still work to be done because all of this have a history that goes like 10-year history of the TNITS. It's obvious that things have to be aligned with the others. So that gives NAPCOR gives us the possibility to do that. specifications, developing, maintaining, and also innovation on that. Enhancements on the data sharing supply chain. This is really important. We are really looking at methodologies developed before as recommendations, but now try to really make it concrete for the data sharing supply chain, like trust, integrity, sovereignty, and the engagement of the EU NAPCO. So it's about how can we make sure that these standards are known and deployed by member states, but also by cities, for instance. So the engagement task is really important, and the communication and dissemination supports all these actions. Thanks. This was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Frank. And we saw you skipped a lot of important, I believe, slides. Thank you very much, but there's a time limitation, and thank you for respecting this. So it's time to ask Federated now, a presentation delivered by Roland van Bokkel from the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. Ronald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicolas. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give you, let's see. Yeah, thank you. I have many slides to share with you, so I need to speed up and fasten the seatbelts. If you go to the next slide.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, we as Federated Project are more or less a bit different from the other projects in the sense that we are a policy-driven project which we were confronted by working closely together with the European Commission and DTLF. And in 2018, we were given the opportunity to profit from the opportunity being given by the European Commission to further develop the concept developed within the EU DTLF of the Federated Network of Platforms that have already developed a kind of 4 building blocks, which is illustrated here. We still didn't know to do it and make it operational. So actually the project, which consists of 15 parties coming from 6 EU member states, plus IATA, the Global Industry Association for Aviation, we got together and said, well, let's try to assist the European Commission in designing an operational framework for implementing, realize the digital single market perspective for logistics. So actually that was the predecessor to the data space perspective, which is, in my view, an elaboration of the digital single market. So there we were standing in front of the cliff, and let's say how to operate and get the things done. So if we go to the next slide, we got together and said, well, the future of data spaces actually is relating in that all kind of IT systems are getting together, and we just have to act as if we are getting into the Internet of Things, not in the Internet of Things only, but Internet of Logistics, that everybody should more or less be able to be used or to act as a node within a grid, within a data grid, like an electricity grid or a power grid. So everybody should be empowered to act as a grid within that perspective. And that's not only a platform, that can be any small or medium-sized company as well as a government. By the way, if in every sheet I have identified a kind of link in order to allow you after the presentation to click on it and get more additional information, which is provided on our website. Next slide, please. So what do we want? Which is quite easy. We have an approach that we want supply chain visibility. Well, you can read it yourself. We want to have more visibility. We would like to further elaborate and develop real paperless transport, which is not digitized documents, which is often discussions within also European frameworks about digitized documents instead of machine-to-machine interoperability. We don't like proprietary solutions. We don't like monopolies. And actually, we want to enforce the capacity to become data points within networks and monetize and participate in multiple transactions. So it's about empowerment. And what has been a major focus for the last couple of years is actually that we don't want to discuss standards and developing new standards. We want to talk about overlaying overarching perspectives towards interoperability, whereas based on also the confrontations many of our partners had by, for instance, implementing the Reporting Formality Directive, and you see it also with the EFDI. Don't talk data standards, but talk about harmonized data interoperability. So actually semantic interoperability based on events related to also what's happening in the internet has one of the major scopes within our project. And we have developed a whole vision on it. You can click on it next time. Next slide, please. What actually, and I already saw the question, what is federated in our question, in our solution? Federated is allowing everybody to browse and query around the internet and the federated of platforms. You start with readable data. You have the opportunity of entering and accessing different data in different systems. So it's a not centralized perspective. You do it through a kind of yellow pages. You have an index where you present your linked data, and there's an authentication and security mechanism in place. And based on that, you can do any kind of business, and that's based on a set of arrangements. Next slide, please. This is actually, do you speak federated? In order to do our semantic interoperability and further elaborate on it, we developed also a reference model, which actually translates many of the objects into digital twins connected to the need for translating many of the aspects of logistics into events. We have many workshops on it. The click here under, you can access and watch all the kind of important information we have developed after the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So the focus of the federated operational framework, which we more or less now have more or less ready, and we have on offer to you, is it's all about node. You should be allowed to become a node. In order to become a node, you function as a node in a grid. And we go to the next click, please. If you click, yeah, the grid, which is actually translated into the functional requirements of the grid, are that it provides you sufficient security, controlled access, language abilities, and discoverability. So you should be knowable and you should know where to get to. So in order to do that, you need capabilities, which is the next click, please. The capabilities relate to everybody that wants to be able to function as a node, should be able to master semantics in a higher level or a lower level. And well, you see the terms yourself, and you should be able to present your data. So how does that translate in the next phase? Please click. In a set of agreements. Based on all these capabilities, you're able to agree and make not only peer-to-peer connectivity, but connectivity and arrangements with anyone, which can be adjusted and be acknowledged as being a node. Next slide, please. What is very important? No, just one back, please, if possible. What is very, very important, and I'm speaking not about as a technician, but as a policy associate and also a participant of the Dutch government, that what we have discovered, that there needs to be a proactive approach of governments and the European Commission in making this happen, realizing it. And therefore, the organizational requirements in order to make this possible is that there should be a kind of regulatory approach on a national but also an EU basis. We also have the policy initiatives. That's not so difficult, but we need for certain a regulatory approach. Otherwise, we never get a long-term commitment of all the different companies, because and that's what we see in our project as well. They love to do an experiment on sharing, but as long as there's not a long-term commitment from the governments that this is going to happen, they will not participate because they don't see the return on investment coming. And there needs to be a kind of government structure as well. Next slide, please. So how does that relate? The regulatory approach, you get a set of agreements, you have international autonomy, you can decide yourself whether you want to participate as a platform within the data space or whatever. There's a federation according to agreed set of rules, and you have the capabilities. And what is the essence of the regulatory approach, which we more or less recommend to the European Commission to adopt, is that the specifications for a node are to be further identified, possibly in a regulated approach, where you set the minimum rules to become a node relating semantic server registry, identification, authorization, authentication, and the index. If these capabilities are there, you're able to communicate and set agreements according to a set of protocols. The components are further illustrated and identifying the different specs, and they are that is a multiple. There are many different components to be mentioned, but based on these components, you can develop different kind of agreements. If you can go to the next slide, please. The business process and the technical specs we have identified is you can make unlimited kind of transactions in different processes as a data holder and a data user becoming a node. And the next click is that based on all the different components we have identified, and within the project we are at the moment identifying and setting the technical specs relating these components and qualifying them towards one another, and possibly also turning them in validation criteria. Then based on these kind of components, you probably can constitute a EU freight mobility data space, or which can also be called EU operational framework. This is still under production. We are further developing the issue. If you go to the next slide, what we are doing within the federated project, which is running till the end or the beginning of next year, we are developing at the moment a prototype of a federated node, and that is going to be experimented between different countries, different partners within our project, and we are identifying a business case, making available to the different parties how they can further connect based on the perspective of a node. And this node will be on offer to you. It will be further elaborated and being shown in the next slide. And the next slide, this is actually the coding and the specific detailing on how a node could look like, and also can use possibly as a middleware for the further development of the EU data space policy approach and operational framework. But if you go to the next slide, we will further develop and show to you. Oh no, this is sorry, I'm going too fast. The fasten the seat belt is not really working for me as well. What is actually the conclusion to us is that we think we have built a kind of provisionary operational framework serving as a bridge to get from a mobility data space perspective and meeting the operational brainpower needs in order to develop a concept that can be used not only by the different technology providers or software providers, but also enable different stakeholders for a long-term commitment. And then I get to the last slide, which is a bit of a chaos. We offer you the opportunity to look further in our results at our final event, which we call the EU Data Logistics Festival, which will be held on the 30th of November. There we show how the federated node could look like, what we have reached and achieved within our project. And we will further invite you to also participate in the event and make your pitch, and have a marketplace in the afternoon session where different initiatives will come together and we can further collaborate. And let's see what we get. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roland, for this great presentation indeed. And it's time for our next presenter, Dr. Eusebiu Katana, Senior Project Manager at Innovation and Deployment Hertico, to deliver a presentation on Phoenix. Eusebiu.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikos. Next slide. So I'm working also as expert for DTLF since Mandate 1 started as team leader for the interoperability and the standards. Now we continue in Mandate 2. And Phoenix, of course, is running in parallel with the federated project, but at a larger scale. And in my presentation today, of course, I will give you a short overview, which kind of methodology we have implemented, and also how we can contribute to your project, so PrepDSpace4Mobility. And at the end, I will close with the main achievements. Next slide. So why Phoenix? So Phoenix, as I said, is based on the work done during the DTLF, so Digital Transport Logistics for Expert Group, subgroup number 2, Corridor Information System. And the idea when we developed this concept is it was to build this federative network of platforms as enabler for future business to administration and business to business. So basically, Phoenix, of course, aimed to interconnect different digital platforms, so to build a federation of platforms, to assure a certain degree of interoperability based on different protocols. So I included in my presentation also a number of details regarding these aspects, regarding the common protocols, interoperability, how data sharing can be implemented. And as you know, in transport and logistics, there are, let's say, more than 90% of companies, they have less than 10 tracks. So it's very important to see how we can support them to implement the digital transformation and to overcome this fragmentation on the market. Next slide. So in Phoenix, there are more than 100 partners involved, covering all 20 corridors and 4 motorways of the sea, so for all motorways of the sea. So we cover all aspects regarding the multimodality, synchromodality, intelligent hubs, network optimization. There are 11 large pilot sites across Europe, covering any business aspect as well. So next slide. So I think Roland also presented the principle regarding the federation. So we developed and implemented the federative network platform, so the Phoenix, using a number of design principles and governance. So centralization as the first place, to build a new kind of ecosystem of data and services, and trust story and data sovereignty. So we also fed with different inputs, different DTLF teams. We included in Phoenix a very specific or package or activity related to legal aspects, related to interoperability, related to standards, and I will include it in my presentation. I think in the last slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So basically, we develop and please go to previous slide. So we develop a connector, a Phoenix connector, in order to be able to connect one-to-many all platforms. We identified when we started to write the Phoenix proposal around 122-23 platforms in Europe. In Phoenix already are federated 24 platforms, and the process will continue under Phoenix 2.0. Next slide. Zoom in at the connector level. So this was implemented based on 3 main pillars. So to have an identity registry at the federation level, to implement governance and data sharing federated services, and also to link to the corridor service registry. So basically, it's a node under a gateway AP protocol. And of course, this is according to the requirements, business requirements, and also the processes related to privacy and security policy. It's built as a building block. So we already tested and demonstrated on the 8th of February in Brussels. So it was a very large demonstration. So maybe some of you already attended. So we did this very large demonstration with all pilot sites presented, all the results at the Procter & Gamble premises. Next slide. I included here just only the meta use cases at the federation level. So how to become a member of the federation, how we can get all available resources from the other Phoenix members. So it means through the nodes, through the connector, you'll get access of the platform resources. Request access, of course, to make use of any available resources, authorize to make use of resources, and so on and so on. So in total, we implemented more than 100 use cases, so covering almost, I think, all business aspects related to transport and logistics on freight. So for maritime, for air cargo, for road and freight. Next slide. And also inland waterway. Just when I included here, of course, an overview of the data catalog of resources. So now I will try to give more details about what we did. So at a data level. Next slide. And of course, in parallel with federated colleagues, we also organize a number of technical meetings, workshops, of course, to align our approach regarding the semantic data model, because it's extremely important when we are talking about interoperability to have a common semantic data model. And here just only the structure of the concept that it was implemented. Next slide, and you will see more details. Okay, so this is the overall data structure. It took about 2 years together to our colleagues from Federated to come at a certain, let's say, agreement and to have a common data structure approach. In parallel, of course, we're in touch with other European organizations interested to develop a semantic data model. Next step. For transport and logistics. So we're focused now on transport and logistics. And if you look on the object level, okay, just zoom in. Next slide, okay. You see here, of course, the semantic object models. And you see also comments in which way we did together with the Federated, with milestones, with, okay, so to see how let's say, how it was the process, how it was implemented, how
Eusebio, still with us?
I think we lost the connection with Eusebio.
Knowing Eusebio, he's probably still talking to a screen, so maybe a back channel through mobile phone would be good, Nikos.
I'm writing to him, don't worry. Okay, I'll give him a call. Maybe you can take questions on the other.
Yes, actually, that's what I was thinking, to use this time to ask questions, to take questions from the audience. So please, you have heard the presentation so far. Do you have any questions, comments? If you have, please raise your hand. I see silence.
Well, while we are thinking, yeah,
Alberto, yes.
Yes,
Alberto.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, regarding the identification of the multiple users across multiple organizations and the federation and how to control the access, and if this thing was aligned with the recent publication of the Data Spaces Business Association on the same topic, because they are providing something aligned with the last European Union recommendations regarding identification and so on. Okay. So my question is to what extent this identification and federation are aligned with other EU policies, and specifically from this one of the DSBA.
Okay, I think Roland, would you like to provide an answer to that, or any of the other presenters?
Well, as a simple answer, the identification and all the specifications we have developed are in accordance to what is common common sense and what is being identified also on a European scale. There are already many different frameworks and perspectives. The proposal I have, and I have identified it in various links, that we have identified a reference architecture. We have identified high-profile architecture, and also more on a specific level, we have identified all the specs relating controlled access and identification. So I think it's the meeting is not, and my knowledge is also not sufficient to fully answer your question, but the information is available to check it out. That's my simple remark.
Okay. I've provided the link to the document in case it wasn't, let's say, well known by the audience. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you get the presentation and it has all the links, but I can make you. I can put a link on the chat if you like. Yeah. Problem.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you very much, Alberto, for the question, and Roland for the answer. And I think our speaker is back online now. So let's listen to the rest of the presentation by our dear colleague Eusebio. Eusebio, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, please share the screen. Yes. So I presented, of course, this overview zoom in on semantic model at the object level. And this work, it was done together with the other colleagues from the Federated. Next slide. So I included here from the activity 6, from the work package 6, a number of, let's say, details regarding the needs for digitalization, digital transformation, which kind of data exchange solutions should be implemented. Of course, this will be available further after this meeting. Which kind of platforms are used by the freight community? So on the first place is estimated time of arrival, and then the route planning and so on. So all these type of details are available, and also which kind of data. Please, next slide. I included here, of course, a survey based on an expert group regarding which kind of standards are needed in logistics. Okay, so, and on the first place, of course, dynamic data sharing standards. Then, of course, a number of standards related to the semantics, and also related to the localization, and of course, regarding the tracking systems. Next slide. Of course, when we are talking about semantic data model, of course, which kind of optimization should be done, in which way? So at the API level, at the security level, at the language itself. And also, when I'm talking about localization, of course, it's important to see identification of logistic location in transit, and also if all these activities, okay, will meet the legal requirements. Next. Regarding, of course, the data exchange approach, of course, we did a survey regarding, of course, the transparency through standards. And also, we included here which kind of, let's say, logistic services should be included, and also which kind of, like, for instance, if we are talking about transport documents, so e-consignment note, visibility across of the supply chain, visibility about asset management, and so on and so on. Next slide. We of course, we included in one of our reports the most relevant logistic standards for information exchange. Of course, we took into account, of course, different level of interoperability. So we started with the technical interoperability, semantic, syntactic interoperability, and also implementation. And of course, at the end, dynamic interoperability. So basically, we followed the interoperability model, of course, developed in other projects. And we identified and all kinds of standards needed for this process in order to have a full data sharing approach, consider all these constraints. Next slide. Next slide, please. I included here, of course, an overview for the just only based on our discussions in Phoenix, and this will be input for the discussion in the afternoon. So regarding the biggest challenges, I don't want to give more details now, but we included all this because we already considered to implement a number of approaches related to the mobility data space since the beginning of Phoenix project. So regarding the exchange, the biggest challenges, so one is market fragmented and the second is data security and privacy. We also included some results regarding, of course, the interoperability, and we've seen that, of course, 94% from all partners interviewed agreed to implement different standards related to interoperability for data sharing and so on and so on. Just on the next slide, I don't want to give more details now, but to see that we already did an exercise, a similar exercise in Phoenix regarding how we can contribute for a number of topics related to data sharing and interoperability. Next slide. So regarding, of course, the trusted and secure, so current gaps. So we already tackled this task in one of our package, and we have more details from the market size at the European level about the current gaps in terms of trust and secure data exchange. Next slide. What we expect from a future common digital single marketplace. A number of topics that, of course, should be discussed and taken in the future project as well. Next slide. About the functionalities for a future marketplace related, of course, to single digital market in Europe and not only. Next slide. Regarding achievements, of course, I will highlight, so these are my last slides, a number of building blocks that can be used for future projects. So the concept of federation, of course, a number of other building blocks, a gate, so-called a GLADE, with details regarding, of course, the identity registry, the governance, the data sharing services, security data protection for a federation. So please don't confuse security at a platform level or at a node level with security at a federation level. How to certify in order to be part of the federation, and also a number of very specific use cases related to EFTI, so e-transactions, e-consignment, not dangerous good, and so on. Last but not least, we'll also develop an ISO standard for CO2 monitoring using nomadic devices for any kind of fleet. And since this standard was granted last year, we are also a chairman of an ISO sub-working group busy with future technology related to sustainability for transport and freight. Next slide. And all these activities, of course, we like the Phoenix Consortium proposed to continue under Phoenix 2.0, so as a cross-border data sharing association, but a world association, not only an European association, because we are facing world challenges and we should come together with let's say, the right solution. We learned from the ISO development standard that it's not possible, for instance, to have a full interoperability even for a niche of the market, not only for a sector, if we not cooperate with partners from Asia, partners from and North America. And we expect, of course, to contribute in the Phoenix 2.0, because now we have this challenge. There are large amounts of data remain unusable because of privacy restriction. So large amount of data, of course, is locked down in silos to the privacy concern. And of course, we propose, we have a concept and prototype under development to propose a solution based on secure hardware enclaves and cryptographic fortification. And basically, all data that will be exchanged within future ecosystem, mobility data space ecosystem, will be encrypted, okay? And on the premises, then exchange the encrypted data to the cloud or any other data space or mobility support, and then these data are processed encrypted. So this proposed solution, of course, will ensure that the data is never exposed and encrypted during the life cycle of the computation. And we are looking, of course, for project opportunities to demonstrate this concept and of course to deploy this concept. And then I think many challenges related to privacy, related to interoperability can be solved. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebiu, and we still have time for one question before our break. I noticed earlier that there was one colleague trying to ask a question. Yes.
Indeed,
Bernard.
thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Yes.
I will try to formulate the question as open as possible. Actually, the question refers to the presentation of Stefan Dreher. I spotted the term non-competitive data sharing. So actually, let me rephrase it in this way. If you think on a digital ecosystem, every digital ecosystem which you want to scale up, like the data spaces ecosystem, has some entry costs. You have entry costs because of the cost of operation of the IT infrastructure. You have costs for data curation, for providing the ontologies to interpret the data semantically, etc., etc. So these are the lower you keep that entry costs, the more likely it is to spin up a thriving ecosystem. Yeah? When I think now on the term non-competitive, then it suggests, let's say, my reading of that is that different players, let's say automotive OEMs, are working together to provide an infrastructure, so to say the ecosystem, yeah, on top of which we share data, for example, the test data example, yeah, the data space for test data. So because I have entry costs to enter that ecosystem, yeah, I also need to have, let's say, a kind of incentive in order to provide data to that ecosystem. So, and the question that I want to come up with, how does the term non-competitive relate to, let's say, this kind of incentive that every ecosystem needs to provide in order to thrive?
Thank you. Was addressed to Stefan. Stefan?
Yes, thank you, Bernhard, for the question. But I mean, the reason we indicate non-competitive is because this is coming from the CCAM partnership work, and as you know, the CCAM partnership is is setting up the cooperation between the different parties on really for non-competitive research. That means pre-deployment, let's say. So that's really the reason. But I agree that, these particular points that you raise are very important, and so we definitely need to take this into consideration. But yeah, we didn't go further now than just agreeing that there is a need definitely to share this, and this is a very important consideration that I'm happy that you mentioned.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so the term non-competitive refers to, let's say, the research setup right now, yeah?
Exactly.
But it's a different story on when the infrastructure is operated after the project, yeah, to have, let's say, to cover the costs and to provide some incentives to share the data, I think this is really an important aspect to have that component in the system, in the ecosystem. Otherwise, it is getting very, very difficult to come up for the costs of the infrastructure. And my take on that is really co-opetition in the sense of we work together in providing the infrastructure, but on top there are some applications where we allow the players to be competitive.
Thank you, Bernard and Stefan. Okay, we are well into our break time, but I will get this question from Olaf, but let's keep it as short as possible. Please, thank you, dear Olaf. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Just an answer also, or a contribution to what Bernhard said. It's not a one-way thing, right? So if you are jumping into an ecosystem, the value or what you're asking for, the incentive is that you also get something out of it, which is data. So you're also a consumer, but you're also a provider of data at the same time. And when you put yourself in the position, okay, what kind of data I really need and how I can access this. So I have, of course, some cost to join and apply for all the regulatory and administrative burden. However, what I get is always more than what I have to pay in the sense, or what I have to organize. That's a rule, I will say, in an ecosystem, that if I'm joining an ecosystem, the wisdom of the crowd, the availability, the data is always more than what I have to get in principle. That's the principal structure.
Olaf and Bernard, thank you very much. I think this, for highlighting this aspect, I think this would be the theme or one of the points of the discussions in the parallel rooms. So this goes to all. We are now having our break. Please be back at 11:20 for our next session. Thank you very much for attending. I think it's time to resume our meeting. So if we please remove this thank you. So it's time now for the presentation, a more focused presentation on PrepDSpace4Mobility and the building blocks for a future EMDS. This is a joint presentation to be delivered by our colleague Sebastian Pretzel, Research Group Manager Fraunhofer, and Harry Bastiansen, Senior Business Consultant TNO. So, Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nikolaus. So yeah, we would like to continue what Lucy already introduced. We will dive a little bit deeper into our project, and I will start presenting our work package 2, and then Harry will continue with work package 3 and the ongoing work. So next slide, please. So as an overview over the main work, we are in the first place creating an inventory of data ecosystems. And this will be the basis for work package 3, which deals with the core analysis of these ecosystems. So we want to have a look at the data and data categories that are available there. We want to structure them. And then we also want to identify so-called building blocks that are used by these ecosystems at the moment. And of course, we are doing questionnaires, interviews, workshops with them in order also to identify what kind of building blocks they want to use in the future or are expecting from the EMDS. So next slide, please. So going a little bit deeper into the foundation of the data set. So we are starting with gathering information about existing ecosystems in mobility. These are mainly data platforms, data initiatives. And we are focusing on mobility and logistics. And we are structuring them in different categories. Next slide, please. This data set is already very comprehensive at the moment, and this is the foundation for the data analysis. So we are then looking for categories that are already covered by these platforms, but we're also looking for gaps, so which domains in mobility are not very well covered yet, or do we have specific geographic gaps? So this will be one of the outcomes. And then we are going deeper into the functional building blocks of these ecosystems, and then we will identify what kind of, let's say, identity mechanisms do they use, what kind of governance rules do they use, what kind of license types they support, and so on. Next slide, please. So we already covered very large parts of the different domains, and we want to invite you to have a look at our inventory, which is already online on our website. Maybe Lucy could be so kind to post the link in the chat. And we have already a very broad overview, mainly on public initiatives, because they are, of course, easier to find, and that are, for example, related to municipalities or open data initiatives. And we are still looking for more private ones. So be invited to help us here. Next slide, please. So currently we have seen over 400 initiatives, mainly platforms and projects, but also research initiatives. And 275 are matching our criteria, which we understand as data platforms that are in operation Many of them are covering multiple transport modes, but we have also a large amount of data platforms that are dedicated to a specific sector of transport. Next slide, please. So going a little bit deeper into the methodology, where are we looking for data platforms and what is relevant? So important for us is that we are talking about real data ecosystems, where data provision from one to many participants is happening, and a data ecosystem should, of course, be constituted by multiple providers. So it's important that the ecosystems that are relevant to us are in productive operation and are already supporting data sharing. And then we have defined a thematic and regional scope. Here in the map, you see our regional scope, which goes beyond EU member states, because mobility doesn't stop at the European border. So it's also important to have a look at Switzerland and so on, which is from a regional perspective important for our EMDS analysis. Next slide, please. Then we are going deeper into thematic categories, having a look at what is thematic relevant for us and what is maybe more out of scope. So we structured three main categories covering infrastructure, people mobility, and freight. But we are also drawing the border where other CSAs are working, for example, smart city domain, energy domain, or Green Deal domain. So there are dedicated data space initiatives that are doing the same work, providing their findings also to the Data Space Support Center, where it is merged and combined. So here we are having our clear boundaries. Next slide, please. And then in the different thematic groups, we are going deeper into data categories and use cases. This is important for us to see where is data important, where is data needed for special and specific use cases, in order to really have an understanding where do we see gaps. So for a gap analysis, you need to have a basic understanding what data and categories are needed. So next slide, please. Another example for people mobility. Next slide, please. So we did basically a very extensive desk research approach, but we also leveraged our networks. So all the networks that are mentioned here have been asked to provide information about data ecosystems they know about. So we added different approaches here to really get a deep and broad insight into the platforms and ecosystems. Next slide, please. This is basically the end of work package 2. Short reminder to consult our inventory. If you know about data platforms or are part of a data platform that we haven't found yet, so please contact us. Please help us to make this list more complete. And with that, I would like to hand over to Harry, who is then diving deeper into work package 3 and the analysis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. I will take over. My name is Harry Bastiaans. I work for TNO in the Netherlands, and within the mobility data space, the European Mobility Data Space project, the CSA. I am the leader of the work package doing the analysis on data sources, gaps and overlaps, and on the building blocks. I have several slides on the process that we are following, and also asking for your input for the process. The goals that we want to do is, it's already mentioned before, but again in this sheet, analyzing the gaps and overlaps in the data sources that are available, but also in the data platforms that are being provided, with the goal to come to a proposal of common building blocks that might be used within the upcoming European mobility data space, the deployment thereof. And in that case, we also have to ensure that the alignment to the European data space's technical frameworks is currently being developed. That's the goal of the analysis that we want to do in the work package 3 of the preparatory study, the CSA that's going on. Next sheet, please. To position the work that we are doing, a sheet that is similar to what has been told before, for instance, by Christoph and Dimitros, on the approach that's currently being developed adopted by the European Commission, where you see several initiatives. Currently, at the upper layer, you see the CSAs, one of them being the Mobility Data Space CSA, which we are working on together with you today, as one of the many CSAs that are currently running to identify the needs on data sources, but also data sharing needs for the different sectors. So there are multiple CSAs. As explained by Christoph previously, there's also a need to look across these sectors and therefore to provide guidelines, blueprints for how do we build these data spaces then, not only for specific data spaces, but also across the different various data spaces. So the Federation of Data Spaces that was mentioned earlier, and that's especially a task of the Data Space Support Center, an initiative that has started half a year ago, and their first blueprints will be available, I think, beginning of fourth quarter this year already, and then they will come up with updates of that. And one that's quite important, based also on the input from the Data Space Support Center, it's the simple project that has been mentioned before, the procurement, to really build these building blocks that are available, are required for building these data spaces, but also for the federation across data spaces. Why do I show this sheet? Because it also gives some indication on the approach that we can follow within our mobility data space, and also on positioning that work in relation to the other initiatives that are currently happening in Europe on this development of and the deployment of these data spaces. So can I go to the next sheet, please? So some observations. There are a lot of initiatives in Europe already going on, also in the mobility data space. It was already indicated by the inventory that Sebastian showed. A lot of initiatives are going on, which you could say some are more generic, some are more specific. Generic meaning that they specifically target a sector or a set of applications. Some are more generic in the sense that they try to provide infrastructure building blocks that are available for many applications and many sectors. That's also a consideration that we have to take into account, also in view of this the DSSC work, so the Federation of Data Spaces. What is generic and what is specific, and that needs the scoping of what we are doing within our project. Next sheet, please. Then from a mobility and logistics perspective, mobility and logistics, I think even more than some of the other sectors that are also developing CSAs, they are cross-sectoral and cross-border in nature. It's clear that mobility and data and logistics don't stop at the border, so it has to be cross-border interoperable if there are data spaces in various countries deploying these infrastructures. But also the mobility and data and logistics data sources, they are also quite relevant for other sectors. Industry, tourism, that kind of sectors are very much interested in the data coming from these data spaces initiatives in the mobility domain. So cross-sector and cross-border our alignment are key for the mobility data space to be developed. As said, there are a lot of initiatives already going on, both in the development and in deployment phases of these data space specifics, requiring convergence when we go to the European mobility data space, trying to avoid further divergence in all kinds of initiatives. These observations also imply something on how we do the analysis on generic building blocks, especially in relation to these, the DataSpace Support Center that is developing the blueprint for DataSpace and Federation thereof, but also for the simple project for the procurement and for the governance board, the ADIP. We should not be too, the consequence is that from a mobility DataSpace perspective, you should not be too prescriptive on especially these generic parts that are also being developed in other sectors with which you expect federation, because it may even be counterproductive if from the mobility data space perspective you are too prescriptive, making it more and more difficult to do this interoperability with other data space initiatives. So what we should focus on in the analysis of the data gaps and overlaps analysis, but also in the building blocks, is first of all, what are indeed mobility specific building blocks that should be supported, that will not be there in the other data spaces. So which building blocks are really mobility specific. And for those building blocks that might be generic across data spaces, there may be mobility specific requirements on them. So that's another aspect that we should consider. It's easy to say, for instance, identity management is, you see it in all data spaces, so it's a generic building block, but perhaps there are for mobility, personal mobility, CCAM or logistics specific demands that you have on these generic building blocks that may be taken into account by the DSSC and the SIMP project when developing these building blocks. Next sheet, please. So some information coming from DataSpace Support Center. The first documents you can already find them on their website. They define what DataSpace building blocks are. They also have a first indication on which ones they will define. That's indicated in the right-hand side. Some of them, especially the ones in the lower part, they map quite well to the OpenDay 12 building blocks from the OpenDay soft infrastructure, and they are, you can say, they are more or less generic for many data spaces. So we should find out how the work in the mobility data space is specific for can be made specific from the mobility and logistics perspective on the requirements that they need from these more generic components that they are developing. And as said, they are building the DataSpace blueprint, the first version to be available fourth quarter this year. Next sheet, please. So for the participants in one of the mobility data spaces or logistics data spaces in Europe, but also, of course, for participants in this session, it's especially important that you also get your input on the way that you foresee your use cases, what data sources and data sources, but also gaps and overlaps you see. So that's already valuable input that ZBO provided previously from the Phoenix project. Please provide this input for the inventory that Sebastian talked about, but also we sent out previously questionnaires. Some of you may already have filled it in on behalf of your data sharing initiatives that you are involved in. If not, because it's quite important for us to have a good overview of what is happening, please consider filling in these questionnaires. It's again a call to provide your input so that we can take it into account into the development of the analysis for the building blocks in the EMDS CSA this year, but also for the upcoming deployment of the European mobility data space. The questionnaire is built up of 4 separate parts. Some are related to the data sources provided and data sources needed, and others are related to the data sharing initiatives, data sharing environments. both what is out there, what are the existing data sharing initiatives, but also what would you like, what are your requirements of building blocks from the upcoming European mobility data space. So again, if you have the time and not yet your data sharing initiative is filled in yet, please take the time to contact us and to also in parallel fill in this questionnaire already, so that we have a good overview of what is out there and what the specific requirements are. Next sheet, please. That also brings us to some specific questions which will also be addressed for each of these thematic areas this afternoon. What are the main questions that we would like to discuss with you, and of course get answers in the breakout session, and otherwise through the questionnaires, type of data, share data needs, types of problems you encounter, what platforms are already out there, what kind of interoperability standards and protocols do you use, also data standards, main gaps that you identify, and expectations of this European mobility data space. So it will be discussed this afternoon, the breakout sessions, these main questions, but again, please provide your input. Next sheet, please. I think this was already my last one. Okay, thank you. Then one remark on the timing. We are now at the beginning of May. What we aim to do is to do the major part of the analysis on the data gaps and overlaps and on the building blocks by the end of June, and also provide a first version for review of our report. So timelines are short. Therefore, if you have input, please try to provide it in the coming weeks, so that we can take it into account when we do the analysis in the June time phase. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Harry and Sebastian, of course, for these detailed enlightening presentations regarding work packages 2 and 3. As they develop within our project framework, and we still have 3 useful minutes. So perhaps if Lucy would like to add something for PrepDSpace4Mobility, that would be great before we go to our lunch break. Lucy?
I don't have anything to add at the moment. Yeah, I think the most important thing for us is to get your inputs in the breakout groups. And as Harry said, of course, there's a possibility to answer the survey. That's important to us. So we'll follow up with that. But there's also a possibility to provide a different type of more structured input. Of course, if you would like to use the questions that I saw that Silvio already used in his presentation, the structure of questions that we're already also using in the breakout sessions, this is also a possibility to provide some input, yeah, in a longer or more structured way.
Great, thank you. And I would like, I think it's a good time to mention to all that, of course, we are all looking forward to our breakout sessions. So there will be 4 parallel sessions there, as I said in the beginning of the workshop in my introduction. And you all participants will be redirected automatically. There is no need to take any action. We use the same link, and they will be redirected automatically to their rooms of choice. The rooms, i.e. that they chose when they filled the registration form. So no further action is required by you when the good time for the next session comes. Okay, so I think it's time now to have our lunch break, and we'll be back at 12:45 for our next session. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
See you in a bit.
Nikos, ready when you are. I can close the rooms.
Great. Yes, please do so.
I go.
Yes. Okay. I think most of us are back, so I'm very pleased to see that we are all back safe from our trip to the rooms. I was in the CCAM room, and a very interesting discussion took place. And I think that I'm quite certain that the same happened to the rest of the rooms. So it's time now for our moderators to report what really happened. And I will invite first Stefan Dreher from the CCAM community room to present. Stefan.
Thank you, Nikos. So I will start then indeed by doing my best to convey a bit the outcomes of our discussions in the CCAM community group. I'd like to thank very much all the participants that provided their inputs. I think we had very good exchanges and many different points and ideas, but also many questions. I think there are still some clarifications needed indeed on what exactly the mobility data spaces will provide, or on how we should approach and organize this also across the different sectors. So we looked into these four main questions. I mean, there was 5 questions, but at least the 4 different aspects that we wanted to address. So first, looking at the data needs. So I think here we confirmed what I also presented this morning, where I mentioned that also in the CCAM partnership, there are different use cases that we are being looked at, and that each of these use cases has different needs and different requirements. And in particular is building now their own, let's say, data space. So we mentioned here, in addition, for example, the traffic data, where it's very important to have access to this kind of information in not only in real time, but as well in big amounts of data for proactive measures and planning. And that there is no platform actually for that today. We mentioned as well electromobility data, where it's very difficult to access this kind of information. For example, information about real-time data for charging infrastructure can be very useful for different applications. And there is as well no platform today for that, so it would need to be done on bilateral agreements. We also spoke about parking data, which has very specific needs that today is not provided by the NAPs, or not at least up to the needs. We also mentioned roadworks data, where there are different requirements actually in highway and in urban environment. So that all shows that there are many different aspects related to the type of the data and the use cases that are being considered. And the data spaces need really to be linked to a very tangible use cases, or otherwise they might fail. We then discussed the technical aspects. So there are many different protocols and standards that are being considered here, again, depending on the use case. So for CITS, the AQMP was mentioned, ASAM was mentioned for the scenarios. But the important question here is really to understand first what we want to standardize. We can standardize either the data or the interfaces or the APIs. And then again, the interfaces and the APIs are strongly dependent on the different use cases. We also mentioned here for the technical aspects, the security aspect. So this needs to be ensured for the whole service chain, so as well up to the backbone. Then for the operational aspects, so we identified a few elements that are necessary. So the ID management, definitely, but then as well the data lineage and the data provenance. So having a traceability, knowing what are the business rules that led to this data, and the privacy aspect, so that we can have a trust for the data. The data quality as well is very important, although this can be quite subjective. So it depends definitely on the needs. data gaps as well, understanding when there is missing data. And then the marketplace aspects. So we understood that there are some tools provided for that. There are already some solutions. But yeah, we need here as well to consider contracting issues, agreements, as well legal aspects. So who is responsible and who handles actually the issues between the data provider and the data user in the end. Also one question here for the operational aspect was mentioned was how to onboard such large quantities of data that will be required here. And that leads us then to the governance aspects. So as I already mentioned, there are some questions here for the role of the mobility data space. It was mentioned that we see this mobility data space role more into linking different sectors or different data platforms, because we will definitely have different more mobility and use case specific data spaces. But some applications in mobility might need information or data from other sectors. Like we mentioned, for example, that it can be useful to have access to information from tourism, like hotel availability, things like that. And there the question is then, how do we approach that? Should it start at the level of the sector? So we look first into our mobility specific issues, or should we have a top-down approach so that we first check where we need to harmonize and then we go into the details? There was also the question about the governance board. So who is taking this role and what is the role of this governance board? For example, is there a role here to that this governance board would also link different participants, trying to attract new participants, new data users, new data providers to join the specific data space aspect. Yeah, so I think that's and then indeed we got the message that we need to look for the different ecosystems. I think we mentioned already different ecosystems here, the ones I mentioned this morning, but now as well the traffic data, CITS, and so on. So we will definitely need to check that they are all considered. So yeah, I think that's all I highlighted for the moment for the CCAM domain. Hopefully I reflected the best what was discussed.
Thank you, Stefan. I was in the room, and indeed, this is a great, very concise presentation reflecting exactly the discussion that took place there and including all major points. Now it's time for our colleague John Paddington to present on sustainable and clean mobility. John, thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I think we end up discussing mostly about sort of the structures and not necessarily the specific data types, although we did actually have quite a conversation about methodologies for particularly emissions impact and sustainability. So looking at, well, do we need common methodologies? So we're all working to the same approach, particularly assessing the impact of sort of technology systems, ITS systems, and linked to that, if we're going to have sort of common methodologies, how are we going to make sure we're collecting the right data? We had quite also conversation around federations of different data spaces. So it became quite obvious to us early on in the discussion that clean and sustainable mobility requires databases from a range of different areas, not just transport. So, for instance, the energy sector, maybe even weather. So, therefore, there's a need to actually link different databases together. Do we need sort of federated approaches where a mobility data space can access data from other data spaces? We linked to that. We talked about how do we sort of manage contracts, agreements, and also what happens if something went wrong. So we will probably need independent mediation, and that might be the data space, that might be someone else. Depends if the data space has an interest, and then these kind of mediation contracts become more complicated doing federations. So if you're getting data from one data space, who's sourcing it from another, who may even source it from another data space. So actually there's some complex sort of approaches need working out. And then we did talk a bit on standardization as well. So actually, traditional standardization approaches for creating APIs are quite slow processes. Often, by the time you create the standards actually, well, in practice has changed, or the way of doing things is different. So actually, do we need more agile approaches, ways of working? I think perhaps moving from sort of defined standards, but having data models that are based on real deployments that can be updated quite quickly to sort of capture this speed. I think one of the things of sort of dealing with climate change is we know we need to make changes quite quickly. So actually, we need to work it out. And that's my summary.
John, thank you. Thank you so much. And I will invite now Dr. Janidaki, Joanna, to deliver
the urban mobility.
the report on urban mobility. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So we had our group, we discussed the urban mobility, and to the question, what type of problems are you dealing with related to data exchange? We clustered the comments to data by type, so historical, weather, and different modalities that are needed. We identified the problem of ownership and the where is it? The trusted identity of users is needed. The ownership question on whether the data belongs to OEMs or drivers is an issue. Then we also discussed that there's an interest in combining data from weather. It was also mentioned by John just now, and also infrastructure and maintenance data. We talked about the fragmentation and analysis of data and how the data sharing between stakeholders is needed so that there's a common operational picture, or very much linked to the point, to the fact that public authorities have limited and fragmented data in multimodal traffic and other modes, and that was very much linked to mobility as a service. There's a need for to have data on the ongoing and planned transport and estimated time of arrival, and that was very much linked to logistics that comes into urban. It's not so separate. And what was also mentioned was this common metadata profile that is needed. Then we took the second part of the question, which is on the data platforms. We listed some of them, and of course that's kind of a homework for everybody, because we very much understand that the project has already identified 400 of these data platforms. So it's a matter of understanding if all the platforms are there that colleagues are using. Then we move to the technical needs, to the interoperability question. We discussed about the standards that are not matching really, and the need for common standards and harmonization. We discussed about the interfaces that don't match and the need for interconnected visual and analytics interfaces. What was also mentioned was the common metadata profile, very interestingly. At the end, we also mentioned this peer-to-peer or peer-to-cloud communications that is important in this technical view of the topic, on the topic. What was also mentioned was certificates for properties provided by trusted parties to avoid the sharing sensitive data sometimes. The semantics topic was very much mentioned and posted, and there was a point on federated interoperability. So that is where we see a federated broker and services and so on, so that all platforms are able to exchange cross-border and cross-sector. So meaning energy data, navigation data accessible to different spaces, and the need to integrate them. Then we kind of had an extra question or a more focused discussion on the types of standards to be endorsed. And we were mentioning standards such as DATEX 2 and TPEG and other standards like NATEX and so on. And the fact that some big players have proprietary standards and how we would be able to cope with that, and that converting standards usually also means investment, so means cost. And that is an interesting technical need that also puts the discussion in the operational part as well. On the operational needs, we discussed the gaps that were identified, and the lovable data requirements was mentioned, which basically is referring to the MMTs, and the need to publish a standard and also an easy guide for e-users and data owners. So that makes data lovable and easy to use and so on and so forth. So that is interesting. Clear functions on marketplaces, and the discussion about all this lack of harmonized type, marketplace, warehouse, and so on. Is it optional? Is it mandatory? And this need for a common EU glossary so that we all understand the same thing. And also we discussed who is running the data spaces, which is an operational and also a governance question. And the value placed on data and how what is available out there is the International Data Space Association Rulebook, or CITRA-ITSA, and how this value placed on data is important because it's not only monetizing data, but it is important that you have stakeholders that find a win-win for all, pretty close to the discussion on TIM 2.0 among stakeholders, and you maintain the diversity and the orchestration of the different interests. And what could possibly be a solution is a foundation or a third party that could function into this being as an orchestrator. This was in the borderline between operational and governance needs. And then we discussed on governance. We talked about the need for clear goals and legal frameworks to enable this data sharing. And let me see my notes. Yes, and that there should be harmonized minimum data to be shared, very much harmonizing the contracts that cities and regions have that are currently very much different. And again, discussing about this, the fact that data should be exchanged as a minimum when it's very much concerned the civic protection and public safety. We identified that as a use case based streamlining of data standards, where you actually extract or you have subsets or domain fragments on specific domains, geographical areas, reduced to what is necessary for the moment, and that is important, especially in emergency situations. And then last, we talked about taking the existing and the upcoming EU legislation into account when we are discussing and we are building the European mobility data space, so there's no contradiction among the legal framework and the European mobility data space. And of course, that there should be a regulatory sandboxes on AI. I think that was it. Yes.
And knowing you, I'm sure that you haven't omitted anything. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for this very comprehensive report. And it's time for Dr. Katana, Eusebio Katana, to give a report on logistics.
Thank you very much. So there are many questions, still open questions, but we'll try to see how we can move on. So first important, of course, topic related to the technical requirements. Of course, in logistics, there are many standards And now I think the best approach is to see how we can harmonize this standard, because we already started, I think, this process about 1 year ago, and I assume that we should see how ISO organization can play a better role, because if you like to try to bring together all the standardization bodies, I think we need this type of approach. Other important requirements, Joanna mentioned about the metadata profile. So we are talking, of course, about a future semantic web standard for data sharing. And I think this kind of standard can include different domains or sectors. And then I think we can solve a very important challenge. Other important technical requirements is, of course, is to define a single access point for marketplaces, for federations, and for data spaces. But this approach, of course, will trigger a complex certification approach. So we already presented what we did, of course, at the marketplaces and at a federation level. Of course, so what we did in the IOLIX marketplace to certify. So and in Phoenix Federation to have just only one single access point. And then everybody can have access of all resources from the federation. So more or less, this approach should be expanded, but at a data space level. And again, this will bring extra challenges. Other important, of course, requirements related to technical requirements, of course. So it's important to see if, for instance, the current application program interfaces are used, or which kind of APIs can be used or should be harmonized. Regarding, of course, the customs and the trend compliance regulations, of course, they also have a number of projects, tools that are used. Again, this should be harmonized at the European level. And last but not least, when I'm talking about the freight payment and the settlements, at the moment, there are, of course, many some kind of payment, and this, of course, will have an important influence on the market. So it's important to see how this can be harmonized, and finally to have a common approach. Regarding of course, we have also other specific requirements, for instance, related to how we should provide incentives to the data owners in order, of course, to share the data. One important, of course, aspect is new business models. So in the new business models, we should also include a subset about this in our next projects, about these specific requirements. Because if the data owners are not motivated, of course, and they are not sure that the data are used for the right purpose, of course, they will not cooperate and they are not interested to join. About the visibility of data, about, of course, the trust and security. So the cybersecurity, of course, we discussed the potential approach, of course, to use in the future ecosystem encrypted data and to process encrypted data. So all data are encrypted, and then, of course, we'll avoid, let's say, this current, let's say, weakness. Regarding of course, the data governance, the idea, of course, I think one of our colleagues, of course, proposed that the European Commission should provide some kind of guidelines for further development, because when you are developing a prototype in one project, of course, we are developing islands, and then will be one more challenge to see how these islands will be, let's say, will start to work together, to talk to each other, and used in a new, let's say, framework. Okay. Other important requirements, of course, it was for SMEs to have some kind of standard contracts, because it's a huge challenge in transport and logistics. 90% of all companies, of course, they have less than 10 trucks. They don't have IT departments. They don't have legal departments, and it's an important, let's say, a demand to solve this requirement. Just a moment. Okay, to look on my notes. Regarding, of course, the functionalities, the future functionalities, of course, should be used and should support common data standard and formats. We discussed, of course, about ECMR, and other specific services. Data governance, I think, for instance, should be in a way, I don't know in which way can be, let's say, improved. But anyway, when we propose in our project, of course, we should take this approach and should involve public authorities to see how, for instance, they can be involved and they can be more involved in our project. Compliance with regulations, because there are many regulations that, of course, should be implemented, and this is also an important, let's say, requirement discussed. Transparency and accountability. So we should see which kind of, let's say, specific mechanism can be implemented. To ensure, of course, not only that the data are used, but also the data, of course, is used ethically, because we might have this, let's say, challenge in transport and logistics. About interoperability, I think we already discussed, and my colleagues also highlighted a number of topics. For security, I mentioned this potential approach, so to use in the future ecosystem data encrypted, and this approach, of course, can be used like a middleware, of course, to support all these aspects. At the federation level, of course, we might consider, of course, this type of platform to encrypt and to use all data encrypted. About, of course, the lack of standardization and lack of trust, I think we already, let's say, highlighted. Also, my previous colleagues highlighted. Regarding, of course, the final, of course, the challenges, of course, market it's fragmented in logistics, and we should provide a solution. And of course, the proposed solution is those, of course, to provide graphical interface, so-called intelligent dashboard. One important aspect, of course, and it's an important challenge, of course, from the public authority side, is the technical infrastructure. For instance, if we are talking about, of course, precise location for autonomous driving, for automation. So I gave that example, so hub-to-hub truck platoon use case for logistics, of course. Technical infrastructure, so roadside units should be, let's say, considered and integrated. And one important aspect, of course, in other project, we tested cybersecurity, so vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle, and we implemented a number of, let's say, standards, so 8C 1.3.1, but it's still an important challenge, and we should involve in this, let's say, exercise also public authorities. And I think that's it.
Yes. It's great that you brought all this information forward, like the previous speakers. So I think it's time that we conclude the event. So EMDS, we heard it from the Commission, from the projects, and then from the mobility stakeholders. We have a rounder, let's say, view of its many aspects by now. And for sure, your inputs and suggestions will enhance our action, the PrepDSpace4Mobility. I would like to thank you all. Big thanks to my colleagues and to PrepDSpace4Mobility team, and above all to you that you attended, provided inputs, and supported the whole process. Thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you soon in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Hope to stay in touch. Please reach out anytime to us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Is that I guess it is time to close the meeting.